All right, we are going to finish today Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. We are in chapter 17. It is entitled World War II Breaks Out. After King Edward VIII abdicated, many well-educated Britishers, including members of Parliament and retired naval and military officers of high rank, carried on a strenuous campaign to try to convince the leaders of the British government of the truth regarding the international bankers' conspiracy. Among these were Captain A. H. M. Ramsay and Admiral Sir Barry Domville, KBE, CB, CMG. Captain Ramsay was educated in Eton College and Sandhurst Military College. He served with His Majesty's Guard in France from 1914 to 1916 when he was seriously wounded. He was appointed to regimental headquarters after recovering from his wounds. Later, he was transferred to the British War Office. He served with the British mission in Paris until the war ended. He was elected to Parliament in 1931 as member for Midlothian, Peeblesshire, and served in that capacity until 1945. Admiral Sir Barry Domville had a brilliant naval career. He earned the reputation of being one of Britain's better gunnery officers. He started his naval service in 1894 as a midshipman in sail and steam-driven warships. Because of his ability, he received accelerated promotion and was made lieutenant in 1898. In 1906, he was awarded the Gold Medal of the Royal United Services Institution. He was placed in command of destroyers in 1910. When World War I appeared unavoidable, he was appointed Assistant Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defense. After hostilities started, he was appointed to Harwich striking force consisting of light cruisers and destroyers under Admiral Sir Reginald Tyrwhitt. He commanded 7 destroyers and light cruisers, all of which earned an enviable reputation as fighting ships. He was made flag captain of Admiral Tyrwhitt in 1917 and served in that capacity until the end of the war. Excuse me, I'm stuttering here. His post-war service included Director of Naval Intelligence, President of the Royal Naval College, Greenwich, and Vice Admiral commanding the War College. He retired in 1936 with the rank of full admiral. During the years 1920 to 1923, because of his special ability and varied war experience, he was first assistant director and subsequently director of the Plan Policy Division of the Admiralty Naval Staff. In this capacity, he attended a number of conferences at Paris, Brussels, Spa, San Remo, and the Washington Naval Conference. Both these ex-officers, one Army, the other Navy, suspected the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had been plotted and planned, financed and directed by men who considered the liquidation of the British Empire was essential before they could achieve undisputed control of the wealth, natural resources, and manpower of the entire world. Both these gentlemen have been frank to admit that until 1935, they had failed to identify those who constituted the secret power behind the world revolutionary movement and international affairs. In 1933, by reason of their studies and research, they reached a decision that the leaders of the world Jewry, headed by the international Jewish bankers, were the secret power behind the world revolutionary movement. They became convinced that these men used the wealth they possessed to purchase sufficient power to influence international affairs in such a manner as to bring nations into conflict with each other. They also reached the conclusion that the motive behind the long range plan was to establish the Messianic age so that international Jewry, with a central government in Palestine, could enforce their totalitarian ideology, upon the peoples of the entire world. With this latter conclusion, I agree. As the readers know, I admit going through the same period, i.e., 1907 to 1933, in doubt and uncertainty. But in 1939, I became convinced, after the way the Jews had been purged by Stalin in Russia and used to start abortive revolutions in other countries, and then abandoned to their fate, that the men who constitute the secret power behind national and international affairs were the Illuminati, who used Zionism and anti Semitism, communism and fascism, socialism and selfish capitalism to further their secret plans to bring about a one world government, which they intended to control in exactly the same way as they had controlled Russia in the person of Lenin after October 1917. A worldwide dictatorship is the only type of government which could, by police rule, enforce their edicts upon the people and thus assure peace. If there is only one state government by one dictator, there can't be any wars. This is pure logic, because to have a dispute, a quarrel, a fight, a revolution, or a war, there must of necessity be two individuals holding opposing ideas and opinions, which they intend to make the other party accept or force of arms if argument and negotiation fail. Furthermore, my studies and research convinced me that from the time of Christ right down to the present day, the men who have been the secret power behind national and international intrigue have always used their wealth illegally to obtain the power and influence to put their secret plots and plans into effect. They have used usury, bribery, corruption, graft, illegal methods of traffic and trade, slavery, assassinations, war, revolutions, prostitution, drugs, liquor, and any and every other form of licentious and vice to bribe, blackmail, or in other ways, force unwilling humans to do their bidding. These tools, be they Jew or Gentile, Freemason or otherwise, have been, without exception, liquidated by one method or another if, after serving their purpose, they were considered to know too much. Considering these facts, I became convinced that the top conspirators did not belong to any one race or nation. They were agents of Satan, doing his will and serving his purpose here on earth. The one and only purpose of the devil is to win the souls of men away from Almighty God. The men who plot and plan wars and revolutions have done a great deal to bring about a godless world. This reasoning enabled me to understand the evil genius of these men. They could not move nearer to their totalitarian materialistic goal without fomenting wars and revolutions. They must, of necessity, destroy the civilization founded in accordance with the divine plan of creation before they could impose their evil totalitarian ideology upon the peoples of the world. Both Captain Ramsey and I can't say that word. It's not admirable, it's Admiral. Forgive me. I said it wrong so many times. Admiral Domville tried from 1936 to 1939 to prevent Britain becoming engaged in war with Germany because they considered international Jewry intended to arrange a war in which the German and the British empires would destroy each other. The people who survived could be easily subjugated by communism afterwards in exactly the same way Russia had been communized. I agree that World War II was engineered by the Illuminati, who used anti communism, anti fascism, anti Semitism, and anti everything else to further their evil long range plans and secret totalitarian ambitions. I arrived at that conclusion that it was a fatal mistake to be anti anything but anti evil. I believe the only way to defeat the diabolical international conspiracy is to educate as many people as possible in regard to tile truth and convince them that they have been used as pawns in the game by these evil men. Captain Ramsey tried hard to convince Mr. Neville Chamberlain that it was against the best interest of tile. I don't know why they keep saying tile. That must mean something. I don't really know. British Empire to allow the international conspirators to involve Britain in war with Germany. He was right. He did not convince the British Prime Minister, but he at least impressed him sufficiently so that when he went to Munich, he compromised with Hitler and returned to England, waving exuberantly his famous umbrella and a paper which he said was an agreement guaranteeing peace in our time. Immediately this announcement was made, the press, controlled by the international bankers, started an anti fascist campaign of hate. The controlled press damned Chamberlain as an old woman willing to buy peace at any price. They lampooned him with his umbrella. They accused him of being pro fascist. Their agents in Moscow burned Chamberlain in effigy in public squares. The British public was never allowed to know the difference between pagan Aryan Nazism and Christian anti-communistic fascism. According to the press, German and Italian fascism are both black, pagan, atheistic ideologies and totalitarian in purpose. Few people understand the difference between Nazism and fascism and communism and socialism. Space does not permit recording all the details of the intrigue put into effect by the evil group who were determined to bring about war between Britain and Germany. In my opinion, Hitler's anti-Semitic policy was wrong, but throwing Britain and Germany at each other's throats wasn't going to save the Jews residing in Germany, Poland, and other countries from persecution and death. Forcing the countries into a war enabled the anti-Semitic hatreds of the Nazis to be vented on the Jews by direct action on tremendous scale, with a hideous ferocity only witnessed previously during a revolutionary reign of terror. And those who claim the way was brought about by the international Jews and not the Illuminati, who don't give a damn for the Jews or anyone else for that matter, would stop and think, they will realize that by fomenting World War II, those responsible condemned a great many innocent Jewish people to death, while most of the Jewish Revolution communists escaped death by going underground and later obtained illegal entrance into Palestine, the USA, Canada, and other countries. If peace had continued, the German anti-Semitic feelings would never have been reached, the extremes they reached during war. A peaceful solution could have been found peaceful solution could have been found for the problem, but no. The long-range plan of the international Illuminati called for the destruction of the British, the German empires, and the Jews, who were not actively communistic and therefore not their tools. Captain Ramsey had promised Mr. Neville Chamberlain that he would produce documentary evidence to prove a conspiracy existed to force Britain into declaring war on Germany. This evidence consisted of secret coded cables which had passed between Mr. Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt, unknown to Mr. Chamberlain and the then Prime Minister. Captain Ramsey offered to obtain copies of these documents to prove that the international bankers were determined to bring about World War II for the purpose of bringing the rest of European nations under communist control. The Illuminati controlled both. Tyler Kent was the coding officer who had coded and decoded these secret documents in the American Embassy in London. Anna Wolkoff was his assistant. Like Guzenico, who felt sick at the thought of the world being plunged into another global war to further the ambitions of a few totalitarian-minded men whose wealth compelled even presidents and top-level statesmen to do their will. The same conditions existed in 1938 as existed in Paris in 1919, prior to the signing of the Treaties of Versailles. Tyler Kent, like many other people, knew Captain Ramsey was suspicious of international Jewish conspiracy. He knew Captain Ramsey was trying to prevent the war. When Captain Ramsey told him Mr. Chamberlain would prevent such a conspiracy from being put into effect if he was given authentic documentary evidence to prove such an international conspiracy did actually exist, Tyler Kent offered to show Captain Ramsey the damning documents in his flat at 47 Gloucestershire Place, London. The international conspirators had, however, been busy. In March 1939, they had tricked Mr. Chamberlain into signing a guarantee to protect Poland from German aggression by presenting him with a false report to the effect that a 48-hour ultimatum had been delivered by Germany to the Poles. The facts are that the German government did not issue any 48-hour ultimatum. The German note set forth reasonable suggestions for a peaceful solution of the problems created by the Treaties of Versailles in regard to the Polish corridor and Danzig. History will prove that the only reason the Polish government ignored the German note was because agents of the international conspirators advised its leading statesmen that the British guarantee assured them against German aggression. Month after month went by, and still Poland ignored the German note completely. Meanwhile, the anti-German press speeded up its torrents of abuse against Hitler because he had dared to defy the power of the international money barons. Hitler had earned their hatred by his independent financial policy and monetary reforms. The public was made to believe, and at that time I was also made to believe, that Hitler's word couldn't be trusted. The public was told after his pitch, which is putsch, P-U-T-C-H, I don't know, into Sudetenland, that Hitler had said he intended to make no further demands. It was made to appear by the press that German note to Poland suggesting a peaceful solution to the problems created by the Treaty of Versailles was another demand and therefore a broken promise. History proves it was no such thing. What Hitler had said was that he would make no further demands after he had rectified the injustices inflicted upon the German people by those who had dictated the terms and conditions incorporated into the Treaties of Versailles. That is a horse of a very different color. It is a typical example of how a half-truth is far more dangerous than a direct lie. Hitler's promise was qualified. He promised he would make no further demands after the problems involving Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, the Polish corridor, and Danzig had been solved. The German grievances were real and justified. By the Treaty of Versailles, the Polish corridor had separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Danzig, a purely German city, had been isolated. The Germans who had remained in the territory, which became known as Czechoslovakia, had been persecuted. The expressed wish of the Austrian people to unite with Germany for their own protection against communist aggression had been denied. Generally speaking, public opinion in the Western world has been molded to blame France and the nations which form the Little Entente, E-N-T-E-N-T-E, for insisting on this policy towards Germany. It cannot be denied that the post-war policy of the Allied powers toward Germany was in direct contradiction to the principles of self-determination, which had been accepted by the governments involved on behalf of the people who had elected them to manage their affairs. Each succeeding German democratic chancellor had tried by diplomatic negotiations to obtain redress and had failed. It was their failure to obtain justice by peaceful means that influenced the German people when they swept Hitler to power. Winston Churchill labeled Hitler that monstrous abortion of lies and deceits, But it cannot truthfully be denied that in 1939, Hitler was trying once again to arrange a peaceful solution of the problems created by the Polish corridor and Danzig, when the agents of the international conspirators deceived Prime Minister Chamberlain into believing that Hitler had issued an ultimatum to the Polish government and had moved in his arms to back up his demands. It was this act of deception that caused Mr. Chamberlain to reluctantly advise His Majesty's government to declare war on Germany. This is a grave accusation to make, but its truth and justification is proved by the fact that exactly the same thing happened all over again towards the end of and immediately after the end of World War II. It would be ridiculous to suppose that sincere Christian statesmen could repeat and compound such injustices as those perpetuated by the Treaty of Versailles. But these injustices were repeated by the Allied powers by the adoption of the policy of unconditional surrender, by the adoption of Stalin, White, Morgenthau economic plan, by the partitioning of Germany, by the evil motives behind the German rearmament plan, by the post-war crisis with France, and, as will be explained in another chapter, by the dangerous game that has been played between the international financial interests and the Soviet and Chinese dictators since the war with Japan ended. Any unbiased person must admit that it is not the common people of the democracies who demand that their governments carry out such a policy of hatred and injustice against the German people. It is not the elected representatives of the people who conceive these diabolical programs of persecution and irritation. It is the evil powers behind the scenes of government who are responsible. Their evil policy is based on devilish cunning. They know that a house divided against itself shall surely fall. That nation divided against each other must surely be subjugated also. The more human beings are forced to fight each other, the stronger grow those who sit back and push them into war. By allowing this secret scheming, plotting, and planning to continue, we are allowing the forces of evil to make us commit national and racial suicide. And that's been happening in America since forever, it seems like. When Hitler, tired of waiting for Poland's response and of being insulted by the Allied press, he moved his arms into Poland. Britain then declared war in accordance with her agreement. The criminal nature of the advice given Poland can be realized by the fact that although Britain declared war on Germany, she was powerless to give Poland any direct aid, either naval, military, or with air power. No lesser an authority than Lord Lothian, who was in recent years British ambassador to the United States, stated in the last speech he made at Chatham House, quote, "If the principles of self-determination had been applied in Germany's favor as it was applied against her, it would have meant the return of Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, parts of Poland, and the Polish corridor, and Danzig to the Reich," unquote. Excuse me. It is safe to assume that had the British people been permitted to be correctly informed regarding these matters, they would never have permitted war to have been declared. But it was war, not truth or justice, upon which the international conspirators were determined. Even though Britain had declared war, Hitler refused to depart from the policy he had set forth in Mein Kampf regarding Britain and her empire. He ordered the generals in command of the famous Panzer Corps to halt on May 22, 1940, when they could easily have driven the British armies into the sea or made them surrender. Captain Liddell Hart, in his book, The Other Side of the Hill, quotes Hitler's telegram to General von Klust, quote, "The armored divisions are to remain at medium artillery range from Dunkirk. Permission is only granted for reconnaissance and protective movements," unquote. General von Klust was one of the Germans who didn't agree with Hitler's policies toward Britain. He decided to ignore the order. Captain Hart quotes von Klust as telling him after the event, quote, This came a more emphatic order. Then came a more emphatic order. I was ordered to withdraw behind the canal. My tanks were kept halted there for 3 days, unquote. Captain Hart next quotes a conversation what took place between Hitler, Marshal von Rundstedt, and two members of his staff. According to Marshal von Rundstedt, quote, Hitler then astonished us by speaking with admiration of the British Empire, of the necessity of its existence, and of the civilization that Britain had brought into the world. He compared the British Empire with the Catholic Church, saying they were both essential elements of stability in the world. He said all he wanted from Britain was that she should acknowledge Germany's position on the continent. The return of Germany's lost colonies would be desirable but not essential, and he would even support Britain with troops if she should be involved in difficulties anywhere. He concluded by saying that his aim was to make peace with Britain on the basis that she would regard compatible with her honor, unquote. Thus, it was that Britain was given time to organize her evacuation forces and get her soldiers back home from Dunkirk. It will be recalled that for the first few months of the Second World War, Hitler did not bomb Britain, while Neville Chamberlain remained prime minister. Britain did not bomb Germany. The controlled press called it a phony war. It is quite obvious that two great empires cannot destroy each other if they will not fight. Chamberlain would not initiate the offensive because he was almost convinced that he had been the victim of international intrigue. Mr. Winston Churchill had been given full powers and responsibilities regarding all naval, military, and air operations. He decided he would take the initiative. Churchill conceived the idea of the Norway Gamble. This poorly planned and executed combined operations involved Britain's Army, Navy, and Air Force. It was doomed to failure before those involved ever got into action. Even a person with only an elementary knowledge of military strategy would have realized that such an operation could not possibly succeed unless the invading forces had control of the Kattegat and Skagerrak. I don't know what that is. Churchill had this fact pointed out to him by competent naval authorities. Churchill is not a fool, but he went ahead with his project in opposition to his naval and military advisors, exactly as he had done when he sent the naval divisions to save Antwerp in 1914, and when he insisted upon the invasion of Gallipoli in 1915. The results in all three of Churchill's gambles were the same: no gains, severe reverses, exceptionally heavy casualties, and loss of valuable equipment and materials. The fiasco of the Norway gamble was not blamed on Churchill, however. His friends, the international money barons, used their controlled press to release their full powers of hatred, criticism, invective, censure, sarcasm, and satire against the Prime Minister, Mr. Chamberlain. They wanted Chamberlain out of the way so they could put Winston Churchill in his place and turn the phony war into a shooting war. This propaganda campaign forced Chamberlain to resign exactly as Mr. Asquith had been forced to resign in 1915. Thus, once again, history repeats itself. In May 1940, Churchill again joined hands with the socialists to form a new government. Mr. J.M. Spacht, CBE, was the principal assistant secretary to the British Air Ministry during World War II. In his book, Bombing Vindicated, published in 1944, he reveals that the ruthless bombing of Germany's cities started on May 11, 1940, the evening of the day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Britain started the bombing, and, as was to be expected, Germany retaliated. Thus, the war was placed on a destructive basis. Mr. Spatt also reveals that on September 2nd, 1939, when Mr. Chamberlain was still in office, a declaration had been made by the British and French governments that only strictly military objectives in the narrowest sense of the word would be bombarded. Churchill's policy to bomb open towns and cities has been defended, but it never can be justified. There is another point not generally known that needs to be mentioned. It has been recorded that many German generals did not agree with Hitler's policies. The Nazi warlords knew they had to get Hitler out of the way and subjugate the communist dictatorships controlled by Stalin before they could carry out their long range plan for world domination. The all out war against Britain was not in keeping with their program. Russian communism and the Jews had to be subjugated and destroyed before they could launch their attack westward and subjugate Britain and the United States. This was the Nazi plan, not the fascist policy. The Nazi plan was international in scope. The fascist cause was national. A secret meeting of Nazi warlords was held in May 1941. They decided they would use Hitler's friendly policy towards Britain to try to get Britain to call off the war against Germany. Rudolf Hess was instructed to fly to Scotland and contact Lord Hamilton and Churchill so he could try to influence the British government to sign a peace treaty. Hess was instructed to tell the British. Hold on 1 minute, I'm not sure. I must have hit a button by accident. Okay, excuse me. Hess was instructed to tell the British government that if they would sign a peace treaty, the German generals would get rid of Hitler and then concentrate all their military power on the destruction of communism in Russia and other European countries. Hitler knew nothing of this plan. Hess flew to Scotland, but Churchill refused to agree to the offer made by Hess. The German generals then persuaded Hitler to undertake an all-out offensive against Russia, pointing out that until Russia was defeated, they could not extend their military operations outside of Germany without undertaking the serious risk of being stabbed in the back by Stalin when he considered the moment opportune. On June 22, 1941, German forces invaded Russia. Immediately, they took action to crush the communist menace. Britain and the United States of America pooled their resources to aid Stalin defeat the German armed forces. Let me reread that. On June 22, 1941, German forces invaded Russia. Immediately, they took action to force the communist menace. Britain and the United States of America pooled their resources to aid Stalin defeat the German armed forces. Convoys of ships were organized to carry munitions of war to Russia via Murmansk and the Persian Gulf. During the Irish Rebellion, a security regulation 18-B had been passed by order in council to enable the English police to detain and interrogate people they suspected might be members of the Irish Republican Army, intent on committing acts of annoyance or sabotage. In 1940, the practice had been discontinued for many years. On May 23, 1940, during the first 2 weeks of Mr. Churchill's premiership, he used this obsolete regulation to arrest all the prominent people who had tried to prevent Britain from being dragged into a war with Germany prior to September 1939, and those who had opposed his policy to turn the phony war into a fighting war. Many hundreds of British subjects were arrested without any charge being made against them. They were thrown into prison without trial under Regulation 18-B, which deprived them of the rights and privileges of the Habeas Corpus Act. Magna Carta was ignored and ridiculed. These wholesale arrests were made by the police on the unsupported statement of Mr. Herbert Morrison that he, as Secretary of State, quote, had reasonable cause to believe the said persons had been recently concerned in acts prejudicial to the public safety, in defense of the realm, or in the preparation or instigation of such acts, and that by reason thereof it was necessary to exercise control over them, unquote. Captain Ramsey, Admiral Sir Barry Domville, their wives and friends, and hundreds of other citizens were thrown into Brixton Prison. Some of them were detained until September 1944. They were treated like criminals and far worse than prisoners on remand. Just prior to this outrageous act on the part of those who did the bidding of the international bankers, the press, controlled by the money barons, had conducted an hysterical propaganda campaign claiming Germany had a strong and well organized fifth column in Great Britain ready to give aid to invading German troops the moment they landed. Subsequent investigation proved that the very competent British intelligence service never produced at that time or since even the flimsiest evidence that any of those arrested were ever engaged in any conspiracy. There is plenty of evidence to prove that the newly formed British government under Churchill was ordered to take this unjust action against all prominent and influential people in Britain who had voiced their opinion that international Jewry had promoted the war between Britain and Germany. Just before the wholesale arrests were made, Mrs. Nicholson, the wife of Admiral Nicholson, another very distinguished British naval officer, had been arrested as a result of a smear campaign. She had stated publicly she thought the plot to involve Britain in war with Germany was the work of the international Jewish bankers. 4 charges were actually framed against Mrs. Nicholson. She was tried by a judge and jury. She was acquitted on all accounts. This action on the part of the judge and jury did not suit those who were determined to persecute people who objected to the international bankers in Britain, France, and America running the affairs of the nation so as to inveigle them into another global war. So the antiquated Regulation 18-B was used to put them out of the way. The phony war became a fighting war. The British and German empires weakened as those who started the war strengthened their positions. The Illuminati laughed up their sleeve. Notwithstanding the fact that Mrs. Nicholson had been exonerated on all guilt and blame regarding the charges laid against her, she was among those arrested and imprisoned under Regulation in 18-B in May 1940. Captain Ramsay tells the whole story of the event that led up to his arrest and imprisonment in his book, The Nameless War. Admiral Sir Barry Domville tells of his experiences in his book, From Admiral to Cabin Boy. These are books which should be read by every person interested in the continuance of freedom. Mr. Neville Chamberlain died in 1940. He was worn out in body and soul fighting the secret powers who governed from behind the scenes. So also had died Mr. William Pitt, those who swim with the tide of Illuminism and do as they are told usually live to a ripe old age. They are showered with earthly honor and worldly wealth. One thing is certain, they can't take wealth and honors with them when they die, and after death will come the judgment. Chapter 18, The Present Dangers. I think I got time. Yeah. By studying history, it is possible to predict future trends with a certain degree of assurance. History repeats itself because those who direct the WRM do not change their long-range plans. They simply adapt their policies to suit modern conditions and adjust their plans to take full advantage of the advancement of modern science. In order to understand the international situation as it is today, we must recall what has happened since Lenin established a totalitarian dictatorship in Russia in 1918. It has been proved that the dictatorship was established to provide the Western internationalists with the opportunity to put their totalitarian ideas and theories for a universal dictatorship into effect. They wished to iron out any wrinkles by the process of trial and error. When Lenin died, Stalin took over. At first, he was ruthlessly obedient to the dictates of the international bankers. He appointed Bela Kun to their ideas for the collectivization of farms into effect in the Ukraine. When the farmers refused to obey the edict, 5 million were systematically starved to death when their grain was taken from them forcibly. This grain was dumped on the markets of the world to aggravate the artificially created depression. Another 5 million farmers and peasants were sent to forced labor to teach the rest of the subjugated people that the state was supreme and the head of the state their God, whose edict must be obeyed. It was not until Stalin became to purge a great number of Jewish communist leaders who were undoubtedly Marxists that Trotsky and other revolutionary leaders knew for certain that he had abandoned the Illuminati and developed imperialistic ambitions. Stalin's conduct of the revolution in Spain perturbed the Western internationalists still more, particularly when Sergis and Marin proved Stalin was using international communism to further his own secret plans and imperialistic ambitions. After Franco won the Civil War, I don't know what they were dropping. After Franco won the Civil War, Stalin's conduct was very difficult to understand. Revolutionary leaders in Canada and America just couldn't follow the drastic changes in the party line as they had been taught it during their indoctrination into the Marxist theories. When Stalin signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler after the British and German empires had been plunged into World War II, it appeared as if Stalin wanted to do everything within his power to aid Hitler overrun Western Europe and destroy the power of the international bankers. The situation looked so grave from the international bankers' point of view that they decided they had to try to persuade Stalin to abandon his imperialistic ambitions and go along with them in a spirit of peaceful coexistence. They tried to persuade Stalin that it was quite feasible that he should rule the Eastern world by communism while they ruled the Western world under a super government. Stalin asked for proof of their sincerity. This was the beginning of the now much talked about theory of peaceful coexistence. But peaceful coexistence between two internationalistic groups or between people who believe in God and those who believe in the devil is impossible. By secret communications between Churchill and Roosevelt, which Tyler Kent exposed, it was agreed that Chamberlain should be removed as prime minister so that Churchill could assume office and turn the phony war into a hot and shooting war. They considered this act would convince Stalin of the sincerity of their intentions. History reveals that Chamberlain was ousted as prime minister in May 1940, in much the same way Asquith was ousted in 1913. Churchill assumed office as prime minister May 11, 1940. He ordered the RAF to start bombing German cities and towns that same night. Mr. J.M. Spatt, CBE, was principal assistant secretary at the Air Ministry at that time. After the war, he wrote a book, Bombing Vindicated. In it, he justifies Churchill's policy to bomb German cities and towns on the grounds that it was done to save civilization. The author admits, however, that Churchill's order was a breach of the agreement entered into by Britain and France on September 2nd, 1939. On that day, the Prime Minister of Britain and the President of the French Republic agreed that war must be declared on Germany because of Hitler's invasion of Poland. They also agreed they would not bomb German cities and towns and make the German people suffer for the sins of one man. The leaders of the two governments solemnly agreed that bombing should be restricted to strictly military objectives in the narrowest sense of the word. Since the war, it has been proved that the real reason Churchill bombed German cities, contrary to the agreement, was because the Western international bankers wished to give Stalin a definite assurance that they were sincere in their desire to carry out their suggested policies of peaceful coexistence between Eastern communism and Western Illuminism. The bombing of Germany brought about immediate retaliation, and the people of Britain were subjected to an ordeal the like of which had never been experienced since the dawn of creation. It is difficult for the average citizen to appreciate the depths to which those involved in international intrigue can sink. It will be proved that the Illuminati had no intention of keeping faith with Stalin. It will be proved Stalin had no intention to keep faith with them. It will also be proved that the Nazi warlords, while secretly determined to crush both international communism and international capitalism, actually tried to deceive Churchill into believing they did not have secret plans for world domination by military conquest. In the spring of 1941, the Nazi warlords, unknown to Hitler, ordered Hess to fly to Britain and tell Churchill that if he would agree to end the war against Germany, they would guarantee to get rid of Hitler and then destroy Stalin and international communism. After consultation with Roosevelt, Churchill turned down the offer made by Hess. The Nazi warlords then tried to convince the Western internationalists of the sincerity of their intentions by ordering Hitler's assassination. The plot failed, and Hitler escaped with his life. When this act failed to charge the minds of those who were secretly instructing Churchill and Roosevelt, the Nazi warlords decided they must first attack Russia and defeat Stalin, and then turn their military forces against Britain and the Americas. They launched their attack against Russia June 22nd, 1941. Immediately this happened, both Churchill and Roosevelt announced publicly that they pledged their respective governments to support Stalin to the limit of their resources. Churchill, ever dramatic, said he would shake hands with the devil himself if he promised to help destroy German fascism. He referred to Hitler as that monstrous abortion of lies and deceit, and yet Churchill must have known that Hitler, for all his faults, was not an internationalist. This action was calculated to remove from Stalin's mind any doubt he might still have regarding the honesty of the intentions of the Western internationalists to divide the world into two halves and then live in peaceful coexistence. Roosevelt and Churchill then proceeded to provide Stalin with unlimited aid. They borrowed astronomical sums from the international bankers and paid them interest on the loans. They then charged the principal and interest to the national debts of their two countries so that the taxpayers paid for it, and fought the war fomented by the Illuminati, while the bankers sat back and made hundreds of millions of dollars out of the deal. This extraordinary generosity with the people's blood and money paved the way for the meetings which the Big Three subsequently held in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. Stalin played a very cunning game at Tehran. He made it clear that he still suspected the Western internationalists might be deceptive rather than sincere. He played at being difficult to persuade and very hard to get. He made outrageous demands. He demanded unreasonable concessions. He implied that in making these demands, he was only testing out the sincerity of the men he knew only too well from long experience were the directors of the international conspiracy. Roosevelt had been well briefed. He gave Stalin everything he asked for. Churchill had to go along or lose the financial backing of the international moneylenders and the military support of the United States. Then came Yalta. Stalin changed his attitude. He pretended he had been won over. He became the most perfect host. Churchill and Roosevelt were dined and wined. Stalin dissolved the Comintern. The Comintern was the executive body which had plotted and planned revolutions in every country. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill drank damnation to the Germans. Roosevelt assured Stalin that after they were through, there wouldn't be enough German left to worry about. He is reported to have advocated shooting 50,000 German officers without trial. The controlled press has never stopped harping upon the Nazi policy of genocide against the Jews, but it has been singularly silent in regard to Roosevelt's policy of genocide against the Germans. In return for the dissolution of the Comintern, Roosevelt gave Stalin more concessions. 600 million human beings east of Berlin were handed over into communist bondage. Churchill acquiesced in everything Roosevelt and Stalin did. History will prove that at the Yalta meeting, Stalin and Roosevelt had several secret meetings after Churchill had been dined and wined too well to allow him to keep his wits alert. Roosevelt pretended to be friendly with Churchill, but on the evidence of his own son, he often said things and suggested policies which showed that secretly he looked upon him with contempt. Excuse me. Only Churchill can explain why he had to sit and listen to Roosevelt's suggestions that Hong Kong be given to Communist China to bribe Mao Zedong to play along with the Western internationalists. How could Churchill profess publicly such a close and sincere friendship for Roosevelt when Roosevelt was constantly repeating that he considered the dissolution of British Commonwealth necessary to the future welfare of the human race? Hitler thought just the opposite. But Stalin was nobody's fool. He had been associated with the agents of the international bankers so long that he could read their most secret thoughts like an open book. He knew better than any man alive that they had used communism to further their totalitarian ideas. So he played them at their own game. During the final stages of the war, he forced the Allied armies to halt and wait until his armies occupied Berlin. The above statements are proved by the existence of a secret order issued by Stalin to the general officers of the Soviet armies to explain his policies. The order is dated February 16th, 1943, and reads, quote, the burgoma's governments of the Western democracies with whom we have entered into an alliance may believe that we consider it our sole task to throw the fascists out of our land. We Bolsheviks, and with us the Bolsheviks of the whole world, know that our real task will only begin after the second phase of the war is ended. Then will, for us, the third phase, for which for us is the last and decisive one, the phase of the destruction of world capitalism. Our sole goal is, and it remains, the world revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat. We have engaged in alliances because this was necessary to reach the third phase, but our ways part where our present allies will stand in our way in the achievement of our ultimate aim, unquote. Stalin did not show his true colors until after he had captured Berlin and occupied Eastern Germany. Then he broke every promise he had made. This turn in events was kept out of the press because neither Roosevelt nor Churchill wished the public to know how Stalin, the bank robber, the murderer, the international counterfeiter, had put it over them like a blanket. The Western internationalists just had to bide their time. They realized that if Stalin and Mao Tse-tung joined forces, the communist hordes would sweep over the Western world like a plague of locusts. They reasoned that Stalin was getting old. They knew he hadn't too long to live. It was better to curry favor with him rather than have him spill the beans and expose the whole diabolical conspiracy. The Western capitalists considered Stalin's open defiance a serious matter, but they had a trump card up their sleeves. Before playing this card, they instructed Roosevelt to make one more effort to bring Stalin back into line again. Roosevelt offered to grant anything Stalin demanded as far as the Far East was concerned, if only he would play along with the Western capitalists. The controlled press was persistently reported that Roosevelt gave Stalin the concessions he did in the Far East because his military advisors had told him it would require 2 full years of heavy fighting after the collapse of Germany before Japan could be brought to her knees. This lie is so apparent that it was really unnecessary for General MacArthur to give Roosevelt the lie direct. The American generals knew that Japan had been trying to negotiate a peace for a considerable time before Roosevelt made the concessions he did to Stalin. Once again, Stalin took all he could grab in Manchuria. He again reneged on his promises and renewed his defiant attitude. This time, the powers behind the White House administration were really angry. They must have made some suggestion of such a diabolical nature that it even shocked Roosevelt, for he sickened and died. It has been said that he died in the house of Bernard Baruch. The advisors of the United States government then decided to play their trump card, the atomic bomb. The atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to indicate to Stalin what was in store for Russia unless he toed the line. The fact that America had atomic bombs had been kept secret. Japan was already defeated when they were dropped. Surrender was only a few days off. Over 100,000 human beings were sacrificed and twice that number injured in Japan to demonstrate to Stalin that the United States actually did have atomic bombs. Thus, it is seen that Churchill ordered the unrestricted bombing of Germany to try to fool Stalin into believing the international capitalists wanted to be friends, and then the USA bombed Japan with atomic bombs to warn him that he better play along and do as he was told, or else. Molotov was the one man best able to judge what was going on in Stalin's brain. During the post-war period, Molotov was the Soviet's foreign minister. He represented the Kremlin at the United Nations for many years. Molotov married the daughter of Sam Carr of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Thus, Molotov became the connecting link between the Kremlin and the international financiers of the Western world. It has been reliably reported that immediately after Stalin withdrew, Molotov from the United Nations, he sent Molotov's wife into exile in Siberia. These acts alone strongly indicate that Stalin had broken with the Western capitalists who had helped put him in power in Russia. The fact that Tito broke with Stalin after the war ended is further proof that Stalin had determined to go ahead with his imperialistic program. Tito has always been subservient to the Western financiers who supplied him with all the money he required to establish himself in his present position in Central Europe. Churchill's son risked his life on more than one occasion during World War II by parachuting into Tito's territory to confer with him on behalf of the Western powers. Finally, Stalin died or was disposed of. He left this world with his lips sealed like any other gangster. The agents of the Western Internationalists located in Moscow struck as soon as Stalin died. Vera and Stalin's other trusted lieutenants were done away with. Stalin's son disappeared without a trace. In order that what was happening in Russia would not appear too obvious, it was arranged that Malenkov should take over temporarily after Stalin's death. He was ordered to decry the great Stalin, and for a time he did deflate him in the eyes of the people. Then he changed his tactics. He renewed friendly relations with the Chinese dictator. He started to make friends with the Russian people. He sponsored the development of spirit of national pride. By doing so, he sealed his own fate. The Western Internationalists countered with a demand that Western Germany be immediately rearmed. France was a stumbling block. Mendez France was placed in power long enough to have France ratify the agreement to rearm Germany. Having served his purpose, he was placed amongst the discards, as so many others had been. The situation in the Far East was deliberately being confused, but it is not difficult to explain. The Western Internationalists had friends in China, just as they had in Russia, but Mao Tse-tung cannot be considered one of them. He and Stalin had very similar ideas in regard to the Western Internationalists. But both the Eastern and the Western totalitarian-minded groups had one thing in common. They wished to get rid of Chiang Kai-shek. The Western capitalists started a propaganda campaign against Chiang Kai-shek just as soon as the Japanese war ended. This action had a twofold purpose. They wanted to prove to Mao Tse-tung that coexistence with them was feasible, and at the same time, they wished to eliminate the nationalist leader. The press charged that the nationalist government was corrupt and the nationalist generals were lax and did not maintain discipline amongst their troops, that the nationalist troops committed pillage and publicly performed rapes. It is only right to admit that many of the charges made against the nationalists were true. The fact that many officials in the nationalist government in China were proved to be correct and was used to justify Great Britain's policy to recognize the communist regime. It was also used by certain United States advisors as the grounds on which they advocated that America withdraw support from Chiang Kai-shek. What the general public has not been told is the fact that after the communists took over in China, it was proved that most of the high officials who had brought Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government into disrepute were communist cells who had infiltrated into the nationalist government by the purpose of wrecking it from within. This statement is substantiated by the fact that many of the nationalist government officials who came under criticism for corrupt practices were absorbed into the communist regime and even favored positions and accelerated promotions. The Reverend Leslie Millen of Toronto, who was a missionary in China during this period, will vouch for the truth of the above statements. The way international affairs developed after 1946 would indicate that Stalin did not have atomic weapons at the time of his death. Had he possessed atomic weapons, he could have knocked the principal cities of Canada and the United States into a cocked hat. Churchill has served their purpose as far as the international bankers are concerned. He is growing old and a bit troublesome. He has to be regulated into the discard also. But Churchill has been built up by the propaganda of the Western capitalists as a great man. He is the people's national hero. He couldn't very well be disposed of by a campaign of infamy. He could be ridiculed out of office. With rare cunning, the Western internationalists disguised their intentions by ordering the press to organize the greatest tribute a man ever load. On Churchill's 80th birthday, they showered him with gifts and honors. They convinced the vast majority of people that Churchill didn't have an enemy in the world. Events indicate that both the communist dictators and the Western internationalists were agreed that Churchill could be an obstacle to the furtherance of their plans. The communist dictators decided they would use Anurin Bhimvan to grease the skids under Churchill. They indicated this to communists through the entire world when the Chinese dictator Mao Tse-tung entertained Attlee and Bevane at a banquet when they visited China in 1954. The international press published pictures taken at this banquet. It is unlikely that one person in a million, other than a communist, understands the significance of that picture. Attlee was shown as sitting at the head table. Bevan was showing as having been placed at the bottom nearest the door. The general impression was that Attlee was the guest of honor and that Bevan was considered of very little significance as far as the communist regime in China and the Soviets were concerned. But this is how the public is confused and deceived. In China, it is customary to seat the guest of honor nearest to the door. In view of the events recorded, it is reasonably safe to predict that in the near future, the following events will take place. 1. With or without his knowledge, the communist dictators will use Anurin Bhimvan to help oust Churchill by attacking his foreign policies in the House of Commons. 2. That the Western internationalists will use Bhimvan's attack on Churchill as a lever to get Bhimvan out of the British Labour Party in Parliament. At the same time, they will get rid of Churchill by casting doubts into the minds of the people regarding his ability to carry on top-level secret negotiations now that he is past 80. It is possible the Western internationalists may lift the screen from secret diplomacy just sufficient to justify those chosen to lead the attack. By doing so, the threat would be implied that if he didn't step down gracefully, they would make known all that went on behind the scenes in Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, etc. 3. It is safe to predict Churchill will step down immediately. Pressure is brought to bear on him. It is equally safe to predict that Bhimvan will not step down. The chances are 100 to 1 that Attlee and Deakin will leave or be removed from the Labour Party in Britain, and that Bhimvan will lead the party against Sir Anthony Eden when he decides to contest a general election after taking over from Churchill. 4. The fact that Roosevelt's son has given a glimpse of the fact that Churchill had to play along with his father and had to do as he was told, and even had to profess publicly his friendship for the president after the president had so rudely told him that he favored the dissolution of the British Commonwealth of Nations, is a clear indication as to the line of attack the Western internationalists will take to get rid of what so many people consider the grand old man of British politics. The point to remember is this. The Nazi internationalists have, for all intents and purposes, been eliminated from the game. 2. Totalitarian-minded groups of men remain, the communist dictators of Russia and China, the Western capitalists or internationalists, whichever one wishes to name it. Just as long as both groups are satisfied to live in peaceful coexistence with the world practically divided between them, there will be an uneasy peace. But if the leaders of either side decide that coexistence is too frail a structure upon which to build their respective new orders, there will be war. World War III, if started by the Eastern Communist dictators, will begin without any preliminary warning. An international general strike will be called in all capitalistic countries. The action is calculated to produce and paralyze previously referred to. The communist plans will bomb all industrial centers to knock out the war potential of the United States and Canada and kill as many of the population as possible in order to bring about speedy surrender and subjugation. Britain will likely get the same treatment. Nerve gas may be used on industrial areas the enemy do not wish to destroy. Soviet forces will occupy the mining districts of northern Canada from coast to coast. The occupied areas will be used as bases of operation against the southern objectives. The international general strike will tie up shipping in every port in the world, making it impossible for supplies to reach the people of Great Britain. A blockade of the British Isles by Soviet submarines will stop any leaks. The people of Britain will be starved into submission 4 weeks after the outbreak of hostilities. The members of the Communist Underground in all cities in the Western world will evacuate target areas immediately before the attack. The underground armies will return and take over the devastated areas as soon as the all clear has been given. The communist fifth column will round up and liquidate all people whose names are on the black list. Thus will the directors of the Western Internationalists be got rid of in much quicker time than they got rid of their Nazi opponents by means of the Nuremberg trials. On the other hand, if the Western Internationalists become convinced that an attack is to be made upon them by the communist dictators, they will force the Western democracies into another world war in order that they may get in the first blow. As a prelude to their attack, the public will be made aware of the dangers of the international communism. The danger to Christian democracy will be emphasized. The atheistic materialists who have the Western world in economic bondage will call for the Christian crusade. They will justify their atomic attacks upon Russia and China as Churchill justified his attack on Germany. They will say it was necessary to save our civilization, but don't let's fool ourselves. Regardless of how the case may be presented to the public, the fact will remain that if World War III is allowed to take place, it will be fought to decide whether Eastern communism takes over the entire world or whether the Western capitalists will continue to rule the international roost. If World War III is permitted to take place, the devastation will be so extensive that internationalists will continue to justify their contentions that only a world government backed up by international policy force can solve the various national and international problems without resorting to further wars. This argument will appear very logical to many people who overlook the fact that both the Eastern communist leaders and the Western capitalist leaders intend to ultimately bring into effect their ideas for an atheistic totalitarian dictatorship. People who wish to remain free can follow only one plan of action. They must support Christianity against all forms of atheism and secularism. They must support private responsible enterprise against cartels and combines. They must support those who advocate the new economy against those who continue with the old. When a person is in doubt regarding the right and wrong of anything, all he or she needs to do to solve his or her uncertainties, recite the first half of the Lord's Prayer slowly and contemplate on the meaning of those wonderful words of wisdom. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. It doesn't require more than a few minutes to decide if any act to be performed individually or collectively is in accordance with the will of God or furthering the machinations of the devil. If we intend to save the future generations from the fate being prepared for them by the forces of evil, we must take immediate action. There is no time to lose. The reader may well ask, but what action must we take? Excuse me. This is a very good question. If the answer wasn't provided, there would be no justification for the publication of this book. Far too many men spend a great deal of time damning this and damning that. They are anti this and anti that, but very few speakers or writers who condemn an idea, an organization, or a movement offer practical solutions to the problems or make suggestions to bring an end to the evils exposed. First, we must, as individuals, recognize the spiritual issues involved. Once again, the scriptures advise us to accomplish this purpose. Ephesians chapter 6, 10th to 17 verses tell us, brethren, be strengthened in the Lord and in the whole of his power. Put on the armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the world rulers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness on high. Therefore, take up the armor of God, that you may be able to resist the evil day, and stand in all things perfect. Stand therefore, having girded your loins with truth, and having put on the breastplate of justice, and having your feet shod with the readiness of the gospel of peace. In all things taking up the shield of faith, with which you may be able to quench all the fiery darts of the most wicked one. And take unto you the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, that is the word of God. I don't know what translation he was using. That kind of like messed me up a little bit. Okay. Second, we must take practical steps and use constitutional means to counteract the threat of both international communism and international capitalism and any other subversive ideology which may try to destroy true British democracy. In order to carry out the mandate in the above gospel, we must do the following things. A, demand monetary reforms, because selfishness and greed and the desire for power are the roots from which all evil grows. It is only logical that constitutional means be instituted to take away the wealth and curb the powers of the leader of all atheistic materialistic groups, who in the first place usurped it from the governments of the people. This being the truth, the taxpayers have a legal right to demand that their elected governments redress the wrongs committed against them, put an end to all form of usury, and reimburse their treasury departments to the extent of the loans floated during the last century to fight wars fomented to further the interest of those who loaned the money and charged interest on these loans. If this advice is followed, the proletarat will have restored true democracy mid the Soviet and Chinese dictators would have no excuse to disguise their imperialistic ambitions under the cloak of anti-capitalism. B, monetary controls. The electors must insist that the issue of money and the control thereof be placed back in the hands of the government where it rightly belongs. By government is meant the top-level executive body chosen from the elected representatives because of their qualifications to conduct the affairs of the nation in an efficient and businesslike manner, basing their decisions on democratic justice and Christian charity. C, punitive action. The electorate can justifiably demand that heavy penalties be imposed on all those found guilty of corruption and graft, because these two evil practices are the principal means used by the agents of all revolutionary organizations to subvert or force others into doing their will. All subversive organizations must be outlawed, and all people proved to be members must be made liable to punishment provided by the law. Those who advocate the violent overthrow of constitutional governments do so in order that they may usurp wealth and power without having to work for it. Their punishment should therefore consist of performing manual labor and or public services. Their hours should be extended 25% beyond the union limits, and their pay should be 25% below the union rates. The period of their detention should be decided by the way they improved from their negative attitude towards society and religion. D, diplomatic negotiations, because the agents of the international conspiracy always work behind the scenes of a government and always use secret meetings and diplomacy to further their own plans and ambitions. Secret negotiations should not be allowed under any circumstances. If government is to be of the people, by the people, for the people, then the people have every right to know every detail of what is going on. E, Christian crusade. Laymen of all Christian denominations should unite in the name of God to put an end to bigotry and misunderstanding, which enables anti-Christian ideology to keep Christians divided and at a loggerheads. The house divided within itself must fall. The crusade should be organized for the purpose of educating the public in regard to the methods needed by those who direct atheistic, materialistic ideology. Special attention should be given to interesting the youth of our nation in the movement in order that they may be protected from the subversive actions of the agents of the conspirators. The crusaders should be trained to take a positive approach when dealing with those who have joined subversive organizations, either willingly or through ignorance. To abuse, to knock, to and condemn persons only increases their resistance and makes them more anti-social. By first gaining their confidence, the crusader is in position to prove to them that the heads of all atheistic, materialistic only use ideologies only use others as pawns in the game to further their secret plans and ambitions. Once a person is convinced, he or she will be thrown into the discard just as soon as the directors of their movement consider they have outgrown their usefulness. This will hurt their pride and cause them to reflect upon the wisdom of their behavior. Having once created doubt in their minds, it is then possible to convince them by supplying them with a suitable literature on the subject. It was to supply this need that Pawns in the Game was published. A religious revival amongst the members of all Christian denominations is essential in order to change men's thinking in regard to the values and importance they play on the worldly possessions. The hearts of men must be turned towards love of Almighty God. We must learn once again to take a real delight in rendering Him service and in performing His holy will. The National Federation of Christian Laymen have been organized to put this idea into action. F. United Nations. Because the Constitution of the United Nations comes up for revision this year, possible changes may be recommended. It is important, therefore, that all those who oppose internationalism in any form organize political pressure groups in all parties to urge that the delegates of the Christian democratic nations do not lend themselves in any way to suggestions favoring the trial of a world government, regardless of whether it is called a supranational government or disguised in any other way. Churchill's suggestions for United States of Europe was only a move in the direction of internationalism. Only he can say whether it was intended to help the Eastern communists or the Western capitalists. G. Illegal traffic and trade. Because the subversive fifth columns and undergrounds are organized, hidden, and subsist in the underworlds of large cities, and because no revolutionary efforts can hope to succeed without the full cooperative of a well-organized, properly trained, fully equipped, and well-disciplined fifth column or underground organization, it is necessary that public opinion be organized to demand that all those engaged in illegal traffic and trade or criminally connected with the underground shall be arrested and brought to trial regardless of what their political affiliations may be or what position they hold in society. The public must be organized to give support to all honest police officers and law administrators. Public opinion expressed on the floor of the Houses of Parliament must insist that the underworlds be cleaned up and not just raided and scattered. The policy of raiding and scattering the underworld characters has only resulted in creating 100 dens of iniquity where only one existed before. Those convicted should be treated as recommended in subsection C. H. Publicity. Christian laymen must be organized to counteract the propaganda of those who advocate internationalism and atheistic materialistic ideology. Local branch should be organized to insist that subversive propaganda be eliminated from the press, the air, and TV programs. They should demand that time and space be made available so the Christian democratic way of life may be presented to the people. It is unfortunately true that it is several centuries since Christian democracy functioned properly. J. Defeatism. Every effort must be made to counteract the efforts of those who preach defeatism. They usually argue that there is nothing that can be done to correct the existing conditions. They suggest that since the pending fate is inevitable, it is no use worrying. The attitude of the defeatist is like that of the professional rapist who advises his intended victim that because her fate is inevitable, she may as well relax and enjoy it. Those who claim there is nothing we can do to escape totalitarianism ignore the fact that God exists and is interested in the destiny of man. People who get discouraged must be reminded that the only way they can save their immortal soul is to keep on fighting against the forces of evil, thus giving services to God. They must be made to realize that they won't be judged according to their achievements and victories, but solely on the merits of the effort they put into the crusade. K. Brotherly love. Because God has provided mankind with all he requires for this earthly existence, there is no logical reason why some of his creatures should not live in opulence while others starve to death. The theory of the new economics should be tried out to devise better methods for the more equitable distribution of the necessities of life. Once they have been assured to all human beings, it will be a comparatively simple matter to persuade those who have too much to share it with those who have decidedly less and a greater need. To share what we have with others in need provides the greatest happiness it is possible to enjoy on this earth. Amen. By living in accordance with the plan of God, economic conditions would improve to such an extent that the establishment of homes and the raising of families could be undertaken in reasonable security. Conditions of fear and uncertainty would be abolished. L. Military preparedness. Military preparedness is absolutely necessary just as long as the conditions exposed in this book are allowed to continue. Everyone who accepts the hospitality of a country and enjoys the privileges of citizenship should be prepared to defend that country from aggressors, be they external foes or the enemy within. The only justification for fighting a war is to prevent a subjugation by the enemy on the rational argument that as long as we have some resemblance of freedom left, there is still hope that we can overcome the forces of evil and reestablish true Christian democracy. M. International security. The best way to strengthen the international security of any nation is to build up a strong and efficient civil defense organization. To permit of rapid development, civil defense should be made part and parcel of the national and internal security system. As such, it should be a federal project and responsibility. This suggestion is particularly applicable to Canada because the Minister of Justice, supported by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, is charged with the responsibility for the nation's internal security. Civil defense is the organizing and training of the civil population into auxiliary units to augment the regular departments which render public service during normal conditions. Civil defense workers are trained how to protect themselves and the communities in which they live in the event of attack by an enemy. Because our only potential enemies use their fifth column and underground organizations to overthrow the constituted government by revolutionary action and subjugate the population by means of terrorism. It's okay, Dakota. It's okay. It stands to common sense that civil defense should be organized as a counter-revolutionary organization. The Civil Defense Special Police and Intelligence Units should therefore be trained under the supervision of the RCMP so they could cooperate with them to ensure our internal security during any emergency. In action, there is no time to lose. In reading this book, you have faced a challenge, and your response to the action outlined, undertaken with a strong faith in God, will determine the future of humanity and bring about the overthrow of the forces of evil which plot to destroy our Christian democratic way of life. The task is not beyond our capability. We must remember that the devil's important nucleus of evil in this world at the present time is centered in no more than about 300 masterminds. Oh, faith, hope, and charity. We must never forget that the Christian religion is based on faith, hope, and charity, while all atheistic ideologies are based on doubt, hatred, and despair. Almighty God has permitted us to gradually solve many of the mysteries of nature in order that we would use rather than abuse these extraordinary benefits. We can now use or misuse atomic energy. If we allow it to be misused, the powers of evil undoubtedly kill off one half of the human race and cripple most of the others. We can rest assured that amongst those who survive will be the agents of the powers of evil. Almighty God has provided the human race with all we need to live. He has provided for our comfort and reasonable pleasures. It is our duty to see that all members of the human race share equally in the bounties and blessings provided by Almighty God. There should never be a time when the granaries of the Western world are bursting at the seams while the people of the Far East are dying by the millions from starvation. We must share freely and generously with others what we have above our own requirements, because it is certain we cannot take anything with us when we die. P. The Christian Crusade. It is suggested that the cross and the flag be the slogan for the Christian crusade. It is also suggested that the following anthem should be used or close all public meetings held in the connection of the crusade. I have no idea what this is. I'm going to read it, but I don't know what it is. The cross and the flag. The cross and the flag our emblems shall be, our purpose in life to serve only thee. Thy will shall be done, thy kingdom shall come on earth as in heaven eternally. The powers of Satan, our God may deny, and claim there's no heaven for us when we die. All tyrants and despots our faith may decry, the torments and terrors will always defy. We'll march into battle, upholding thy name. No worldly enchantments our cause shall defame. No evil enslavements shall swerve from their goal, thy militant legions, till they reach thy fold. What doth a man profit to gain the whole world by serving neath banners, hell's agents unfurled? Will hold to thy promise, hell shall not prevail. O Lord, give us wisdom, vile plots to curtail. Men seek greater riches, use wealth to gain power, but Lord, we all need thee. Life spans but an hour. Through darkness to daylight, sustain us with grace. We'll fight unto glory. We'll run the good race. Well, that was pretty cool. The National Federation of Christian Laymen. The National Federation of Christian Laymen is now being organized and a charter is being applied for. Our purpose is to try and unite all existing Christian laymen's organizations to combat all form of atheistic materialism and internationalism. The NFCL will be kept strictly nonpartisan and non-denominational. It is not intended to interfere with the autonomy of any existing Christian organization. Our purpose is educational. Pawns in the Game was published to find out how many citizens are interested in taking constitutional action to end the international conspiracy as exposed in this book, and to take legal action to break the economic stronghold a few internationalists have obtained on the governments and peoples of the so-called free nations by their practice of systematically applied usury. The response has been remarkable and justified the printing of this edition. It is suggested that interested persons organize branches of NFCL in their cities and towns and farming communities. Each group should provide itself with a library chosen from the books listed on another page. The material in the book will provide matter for thought and subjects for discussion at study groups. When local branches have been organized, it is intended to send speakers well qualified to explain the various angles of international affairs to address public meetings sponsored by the local branches of the NFCL. Our policy: 1, we advocate Christianity and oppose illuminism and atheistic materialism. We hold out the hand of friendship to all who worship God and oppose Satanism. 2, we support nationalism and oppose internationalism of any kind. 3, we advocate responsible private industry and oppose cartels and combines. 4, we advocate loyalty to the Constitution and oppose all kinds of subversive activities. 5, we support unlawful authority and oppose organized crime. 6, we advocate the practice of ethics in trade and commerce and oppose all forms of illegal traffic and trade. 7, we recommend brotherly love against all God-fearing people and oppose bigotry in any form. 8, we stand for liberty and oppose licentiousness. 9, we stand for freedom as opposed to dictatorships and tyranny. 10, we advocate justice for all and favors for none. 11, we recommend that punishment should be made to fit the crime. 12, we advocate national preparedness against internal and external foes. 13, we advocate active interest and participation in political, economic, health, and educational matters as opposed to apathy, indifference, and despair. 14, we work so that Almighty God's plan for creation may be put into practice in this earth. Join our crusade. The Federation of Christian Laymen is nonpartisan and non-denominational. Our purpose is to help people who have been deceived into joining a subversive movement by telling them the truth, and to inform others regarding their danger from those who plot, plan, finance, and direct all phases of the international conspiracy. We hope to finance our work by selling the literature we publish. If you agree with what we have to say, then help us make the facts known. Send copies of our publication to your elected representatives and tell them how you wish them to act on your behalf. This is very important. Send copies to your friends and acquaintances and to people you feel should be informed about all these important matters. Ask them to do the same. This is our only means of obtaining circulation, as the truths we are trying to make known are being given the silent treatment by the controlled press. We work to retain our national form of government, to protect the Christian religion, to uphold private responsible enterprise, and to preserve our God-given right and prerogatives. Very good. And that ends this book. He does have a list of books. I mean, if you're interested, the list of publications is number 1, Pawns in the Game, The Red Fog Over America, The Devil's Poison, The Synagogue of Satan, The International Conspiracy, News Behind the News, What Readers Have Said, the very Reverend Monsignor W.C. McGrath in New York. Pawns in the Game is the most powerful study of the international conspiracy I've ever seen. Such a book is bound, has never before been written. I pray it may be read by millions of hapless pawns. Shh, shh. Hey, they go crazy over these birds. I took a picture, I'll show you later, that walk in our yard. But they waited until the very end, so that's a wonderful thing. So until that's it. The book is done. Praise God, it's done. So until next time, keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. And I'm glad, Daniel, that she is buying that salt for you. Praise God. I love you all. Bye-bye. Coda.